Many decades ago, in a different era of game design, Capcom would release a game by the name of Street Fighter, and for the most part, the less said about that game, the better. It was a janky experience at the best of times, from the first arcade version being controlled not with a traditional 4 or 6 button control setup, but instead two massive red pads that the player would have to punch as hard as they could in order to perform kicks and punches. Even if you were to look past that specific design choice, you would find a game that still controlled quite poorly, had only 2 playable characters, and was incredibly difficult. The arcade goers of the time said no thank you and moved on to more popular and polished arcade games, like Bad Street Brawler. Yeah, that long forgotten classic. However, that wouldn't be the last we as video game fans would see of Street Fighter as a franchise, as an interesting decision was made at Capcom when Yoshiki Okamoto decided that instead of producing a sequel to Final Fight, he would try to reanimate Street Fighter and see what the result would be after the great success of the first Final Fight. After 2 years of development and about 2 million fat stacks of yen were dropped on the project, Capcom would release Street Fighter II: The World Warrior in the year of 1991. The game was a smash hit and would go on to gross massive bank for Capcom, as well as being the sole reason for the mass revitalization of the arcade industry. And as the story seems to go in the games industry, when you have the winning formula, why stop at just one? Capcom would go on to release numerous different versions and iterations of Street Fighter II, with some of them even going as far as to completely change the way it was played, as well as adding characters to the ever-growing roster, with the original Street Fighter II title, The World Warriors, coming in at a cast of 8, only for the later titles to have a cast of 16, that is of course not including the unlockable or code characters. With all of those versions being so popular, it would be a disservice not to give people a more updated collection of these titles to play in the future. A compilation of all the Street Fighter II releases. It was pretty much just the obvious move. Lucky for the gaming public, Capcom was already looking to do exactly that, as they would release Street Fighter The Collection on PlayStation 1 and Sega Saturn in 1997. The title featured 3 Street Fighter games, all of which were about as close as you could get to arcade-perfect conversions for said systems. Those games being Super Street Fighter and Super Street Fighter II Turbo, with a third game interestingly enough being an enhanced version of Street Fighter Alpha 2 known as Street Fighter Alpha 2 Dash in European regions. The compilation was a budget release and was sold at a lower price than full release games, but that didn't stop some critics from saying the title wasn't worth the asking price, with most thinking that the Street Fighter offering was competent, but many fans thought that the title lacked many beloved versions and didn't feature enough games. Capcom obviously took this as a challenge, and just a year later, Street Fighter The Collection 2 was released on only PlayStation this time, as in Europe and the US, the Sega Saturn's sales were lacking behind the PlayStation 1 and even the Nintendo 64. This is the title we're going to be taking a look at today. Ironically enough, the second title in this 2-part arcade conversion compilation series actually features the earliest releases of Street Fighter II, featuring the game that kicked off the madness in 1991, The World Warrior, as well as both Street Fighter II Champion Edition and Street Fighter II Turbo Hyper Fighting, all of which are playable in their nearly arcade-perfect conversion forms on this disc. And also, unlike the first collection, every game in the collection is featured on one disc, unlike the first version, which had the 2 Street Fighter II titles on one disc, and the second disc housing Street Fighter Alpha 2 Dash. It must have been too big to put on one disc, but I do actually genuinely like the idea of owning each game on its own individual disc personally. Upon booting the disc, we get this cool little intro that counts up through the years of Street Fighter. Although, there isn't really much to count up in this game, seeing as how it only features the first 3 titles in the series, but I do see what they're trying to do. It's actually something more akin to those arcade attraction screens where every cabinet would have this cool sequence where the characters would be doing their things, or it'd show some gameplay, and then it would flash up on the screen the title of the game, to try and attract people to go over to the cabinet and have a go. It's nothing too special, but it is cool that even in the year 1998, we still saw Capcom going the extra mile to make the collection feel like something special and not just another stock standard release. The game has an overview menu where a couple of main modes can be selected. Of course, selecting the one of the 3 games is here, but there's also a section where you can view concept art from each game as well as the entire roster of characters. This is something I've always enjoyed personally on a massive level for these video games. I think the people that create all of the concept art in the early stages of game design never get enough credit, seeing as how they shape how the entire game looks from then on. So having a large amount of art from the early stages of development is always something I mark over. Nestled amongst these options is also a tips guide for each game and character. It effectively gives the player a short paragraph or 2 of explanation on the basics for each character. You know, things such as use Ryu's Hadouken to lure in the opponent, that kind of stuff. The basics of Street Fighter that any veteran probably already knows, but it's still a fine addition nonetheless. Although, some of these tips that they give in the game aren't really that helpful. For example, use Chun-Li's speed, and if the opponent isn't hitting you, go in for a grab. Yeah, but how do you make use of Chun-Li's speed? It's kinda just obligatory and arbitrary. When it comes to selecting a game, after choosing from the menu, the game boots up as normal and you can choose from the usual affair of modes and characters. Here's where there isn't really much to say. You've all probably played Street Fighter 2 or its many versions, so for the most part, it's par for the course. You have a selection from numerous fighters, and as you play through the arcade mode, fights get harder until you face off against the 3 Grandmasters and effectively M. Bison. With these collections, the main point of criticism doesn't really come from the additions or lack thereof, but instead come from the execution. So how is that? Well, for the most part, fine. In terms of speed and frame rate, the game feels on par mostly with the arcade counterparts. The World Warrior feels comparatively ancient in comparison to any later titles in the series, but no less fun. Turbo Hyper Fighting feels faster and with more of a focus on precision when it comes to inputs. Everything here feels mostly fine when it comes to speed. Even graphically, the game looks very close to the arcade version, if not for a few little issues that wouldn't in any way ruin the experience. If anything, I do personally think this version is a little washed out and dim in comparison to the arcade version, however that could just possibly be my TV setup. The characters maintain the level of detail and charm of the originals, and for a title effectively lifting the arcade versions onto a disc-based hardware, it does an adequate job on most fronts. Gameplay-wise, it's a slightly different story. While most button inputs come out fine when it's limited to strikes, when it comes to inputting special moves or heavier strikes, sometimes the game will drop an input here or there. While it did serve to annoy if it costed me the match, for the most part it was just a little gripe I had with the controls. It also serves to be mentioned though that the PlayStation 1 D-pad is complete trash. If you own a PlayStation 1, you know exactly what I mean. The D-pad on those controllers is so stiff and abrasive that it could have possibly been more of an issue with the controller than it was the game. But that will of course completely depend on what controller input type you use. If you have a fight stick, I'd much more recommend you use that. There were a couple of other oddities I experienced, such as projectiles randomly disappearing without reason, but this happened so infrequently it rarely had any effect on my matches or my enjoyment of the game. When it comes down to it, aside from a few small incidents, these games are usually just as playable here as they are anywhere else. If you play Street Fighter for the first time with this collection, you are experiencing Street Fighter to a mostly full degree. The only other thing to note really are the loading times, and yeah, they're here. It seems to be one of the only real major complaints people have towards this title, unless of course you count the tournament players who seem to think this collection is the Antichrist. Yeah, it's a long story and I would rather not get into it here. The TLDR version is a bunch of people boycotted Street Fighter 2 Turbo's EVO competition because they used this version over the original arcade version, and this version does have glitches and imbalances the original doesn't, but for anyone outside of that group of players, you're probably not going to notice it.
That's what I was looking for. You got some idiot named DSP who's a total piece of shit, by the way. I like to get that on YouTube, But this guy thought he was hot shit because he beat me and Choi in a game that was like, it's like fucking Neo Geo conversion of Street Fighter or some crap, dude. and he was so proud that he put under as a signature, he's the #1 US ranked Super Turbo player that year. But I mean, look at him now. I mean, he's just... No, he's got 20,000 subscribers on YouTube. 20,000 idiots are subscribed to him. That's great. Congratulations. Congratulations with your YouTube channel, and hope you enjoy your life, bro. I mean, it's a great victory. PlayStation 1 Super Turbo champion. You take that to your grave, bro. Good luck.
Of course, with a disc-based console like the PS1, loading times are going to appear here where they weren't in the original. And I do get the complaints at the very least. I could forgive before and after a fight, sure, but this game seems to need to load between every screen, including the win quote and character screen selection, and in between rounds. It is annoying, but Tekken 3 has worse load times for the most part, and I actually didn't find myself not hating the load times as much as I do in other games on the PS1. It's just par for the territory, and sure, if you can get a hold of the arcade versions you won't have any loading time problems, but doesn't really take away from my enjoyment. At the end of the day, Street Fighter The Collection 2 is a very decent way to play these classic games, and for the most part, nothing was really lost in translation when it comes to porting the arcade versions over to disc-based systems. That is of course saying that there also isn't much new or much improved to see when it comes to these versions, or even extras that we've been given. Of course, trying to argue for the worth of these titles today is a different story. In today's day and age, Street Fighter 2 has been consistently re-released on nearly every new system, and is actually set to be re-released in the upcoming Capcom Fighting Collection, so saying that this title is worth picking up today would actually be a lie, especially seeing as how it seems to have taken a hike in prices in recent years. If you are a PlayStation fan, or you want to try and collect every Street Fighter console release, I do recommend you try and get this game before it jumps in price yet again. But if you do just want to play Street Fighter 2 and its many iterations, I can't really recommend picking this up due to the fact that there are many superior versions already existing that give you more pack-in titles and more extra features. Versions like the 30th Anniversary Edition, or even the Street Fighter Alpha Anthology, which is my favourite Street Fighter collection on consoles. Whilst it's not a bad title in any way, it's one of those titles that doesn't really earn its keep when it comes to what it does. It simply just lets you play these great titles, and not much more.